there is nothing wrong with living in a world where everyone is encouraged to do things better. And if that is the outcome of athletes and sporting organisations striving to represent admirable values, then, so be it. And if it makes it more difficult for corporate organisations who run the risk of what they do from day to day being exposed, well, again, so be it. That is the world that we live in. And it always has been.
Since the restart of the international sporting calendar, spectators' appetites for global sporting events have only been matched by countries' and companies' desires for soft power gains. The term sportswashing may have been coined in 2018, but the practice of hosting or sponsoring sporting events for political gain has been around since the advent of sport itself. While the Beijing Winter Olympics and the FIFA World Cup in Qatar headlined 2022's most controversial sportswashing accusations, back home in Australia, many of our own national sporting codes have faced their own crises as well. Today on Michelson Alexander Explains, we explore the notion of sportswashing and how it affects all of sports stakeholders. To do that, I'm joined by Michelson Alexander's Head of Content and resident sports buff, Jack Bannister, and the Adjunct Research Fellow for the Sport Innovation Research Group at Swinburne University of Technology, Dr. Sam Duncan. Thank you both for joining us today, guys.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here to chat about what is a really interesting topic and one that isn't going to go anywhere and that's only got bigger, but as you said, has really always been lurking in sport.
And so as you said, Sam, it's always been an issue, sports washing, but the big question for the academic at this table is what is it? What is sports washing?
It's basically when sport is used by organisations. In fact, it doesn't even need to be organisations. It can be state organisations, corporate organisations, and they use sport to launder their reputation, if you like, to take the focus off what they might be doing in their operations that might be a little bit more sinister and darker than they would like to otherwise make out. And so by aligning with sport, they are able to readjust that reputation. They are able to promote themselves in a positive light, all the while whitewashing what they're doing in reality.
And so we know, obviously, sporting organisations are always looking for sponsors. Beyond money, what are they hoping to get out of a sponsorship arrangement?
Well, I think the biggest thing is money. I mean, I know that's the obvious one and you've said beyond money, but I think it needs to be made clear that sponsorships from a sporting organisation are primarily around money. Right around the world, but if we can just look here at Australia, we are a part of one of the most competitive sporting markets in the world, one of the most cluttered sporting markets. When we think about how many professional sporting leagues we have and even semi-professional sporting leagues we have, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is money. The gap between sports that end up on, the front page of newspapers, in all our social media feeds, are the haves, not the have-nots, because it's all very cyclical. Media rights drive that, but sponsorship plays a huge role. Now, what else do they provide? Well, they do provide a range of things, like networking is a really important part. So too is brand and reputation. By aligning yourself to a really strong sponsor with a strong brand and reputation, it is confirming or reinforcing your brand as both of those things as well. Depending on the sponsor, it can also be, access to facilities. It can be access to very important, well-connected people from the political sphere right through the corporate sphere who influence. And all of those things are absolutely taken into consideration. It also connects you to new audiences, different audiences, the sponsors' audiences, and allows you to integrate with them so that if your sponsor is Virgin or Qantas or whoever, all travellers on those flights see and understand and become cognizant of that particular relationship as well. At the forefront is always money. It is the reality, and all the other things I think are important, but they're quite secondary.
And on that point, you said that obviously it's all about the money, and we can see that when maybe large organisations like the NRL, the AFL in Australia can make those political decisions and say, you know what, for instance, we're not going to take as much pokies or gambling money as we would normally have in the past. And it goes without any real effect on their bottom line because they're the big players in town, as you said, and they're the ones they're the haves. But what about for the have-nots? So the biggest case this year was Netball Australia and their crisis essentially with Hancock prospecting when the player revolt basically said, we're not going to wear this sponsor's logo, and the sponsorship went away, leaving them with like a $15 million hole in their coffers and $4 million in debt coming into this year's financial year. Can small organisations take the higher ground and turn their back on sponsorship money that isn't as progressive as their players or their organisation would like them to be?
Well, I mean, this is the huge debate because I think in an ideal world, yes, they can. And, values are such an important part of sport, more so, I think, than ever. I mean, gone are the days where we expect athletes to simply shut up and play. I should caveat that by saying that might depend on who you ask and from how old they are and from, what demographic. That's probably not a universal take, but I think the reality is that athletes are going to speak out and have a voice, and at the centre of that, their values. It is all well and good for coaches and sporting organisations to set their value statements and to set their value mantra about the way in which their athletes should buy into playing and the sacrifices they should make based on the values of the team. But equally, if you're going to ask athletes to do that, you have to then accept that you are running a very values-driven organisation. And athletes, like all human beings, have their values and those values define their actions. And just like an employee would question management decisions on organisations they're associating with or decisions they're making, so too will athletes. And they will do it more now than ever because they have a platform to. They understand the power of their voice, they understand the popularity of their voice, and they have social media and digital platforms to speak. And so there is always going to be, I think, going forward, a situation where management are actually going to need buy-in from the broader organisation, including the athletes, when it comes to the organisations they want to partner with. Now, can they afford it? What is the reality? And are we living in an ideal world? Well, no, we're not. And the reality is that organisations, the have-nots, need money to survive and thrive, to grow. And that means along the way there is going to be compromise. That's also a reality. So the question is, how much are you going to compromise, and what are you going to compromise on? And furthermore, how are you going to get buy-in from everyone when it comes to that compromise? Because finding an organisation where every single member of an organisation is aligned to the values is going to be very, very difficult. So communication and consultation is so important.
Gordon mentioned one of the have-nots there in netball. There's another one that I think is a really interesting test case, which is swimming. And swimming as a small sport is heavily involved with Hancock prospecting as a sponsor and has been since well before the Tokyo Olympics. But is there an extent to which you can get away with it if you're a small sport? Because, for all the furore that was made around Netball Australia taking money from Hancock, the alignment that they've had with swimming has largely flown under the radar. Like, it's sort of not something that's generating media think pieces, for example. But for them, I think obviously being reliant predominantly on IOC funding and not having a fan base that can kind of get behind a team for a regular competition or having a league, they're very reliant on essentially the Olympics and the World Championships to a lesser extent to generate eyeballs, which means that, there's an extent to which they kind of just get forgotten and they can kind of take the money and no one really is noticing.
100%. When you have a situation where you are aligning to an organisation that nobody has a problem with, by nature of that, you're not going to have an issue. It will fly under the radar. And as a result of that, you can have a significant level of hypocrisy. Because if athletes are advocating for one thing in their private lives as citizens or even as athletes, and yet they're representing organisations who have partnerships that are in conflict with that, then then you are going to have some level of hypocrisy. I think some organisations are more willing to accept the compromise based on their commercial realities and needs. And if you look at the AFL and even their media rights, for example, the new deal will generate $650 million a year, $650 million a year. If you look at the A-League, their media rights deal generates $40 million. 650 versus 40 million. If you look at some of the smaller sports like, Swimming Australia and Netball Australia, those figures are even smaller. How do you play with the big boys when it comes to, being front and centre and not just generating media awareness? 650 million versus 40 million is a hell of a lot more pathway programs. It's a hell of a lot more people on the ground doing coaching clinics. It's a hell of a lot more people going into schools and promoting the sport. And perhaps therefore those big organisations can be more selective. And I think there's a recognition amongst participants that sometimes smaller organisations will need to take what they can get. And I also think that there's an understanding in broader society that compromise sometimes needs to be made for the sport to operate. And not just survive, but thrive.
There's probably one clarification that I'd point out there, and I think you alluded to this in your answer, is that the issue around Hancock Prospecting came because of Donnell Wallam, who's an Indigenous netballer, and to the best of my knowledge, it was her raising that then led to the sponsorship ultimately being revoked. If you think about swimming, to the best of my knowledge, again, there isn't a single Indigenous swimmer on an Australian Dolphins team, which I think probably speaks to the question that I know you're going to ask in a minute, Gordon, around organisations and their kind of responsibility to reflect athlete values.
Absolutely. Because we live in a situation now where athletes will speak. They are advocates. They are diverse, so they should be. And they are inclusive, and so they should be. And there are a number of issues, therefore, that will have a significant amount of meaning to individual athletes. And as a result of that, as I said, I can't imagine that the whole notion of athletes being quiet and just playing, or the whole notion that they shouldn't or won't have a say in the broader management decisions of their organisation will disappear. On the contrary, I think they will only become more intense. And that therefore becomes a significant challenge for administrators who have historically gone about their business without worrying too much about the athlete, because the deal has been, if you want to get paid, if you want to be on the team, then you'll just put up with it and play. I think those days are over. And we've even seen it like values decisions, even recently with the Essendon Chief Executive Officer role, where there was a significant conflict of values of two organisations that Andrew Thorburn took leadership roles in. And as a leader, you need to not only be aware of your organisation's values, you need to exemplify them. You need to lead them. You need to promote them. And your objective is to augment them in your organisation and positively promote them in the community. Now, if you are in a leadership position for two different organisations whose values are in conflict, I don't know how you do that. And neither did eventually, it must be said, neither did the Essendon Football Club, who asked him to take a consistent, position one way or the other.
And so you mentioned there that as sports watchers, society is having an increased, I suppose, social license given to individuals and athletes when they want to campaign in their own personal beliefs or political beliefs. But we've saw this year with the Manly Pride jersey saga that when those roles are reversed and it's the organisation campaigning to a point on behalf of all of the players, that social licence seems to be less strong. Do we think that sporting organisations have the social licence to campaign on an organisational level for values and campaigns that they believe in?
I've done some research in this, and I think you'll find if you ask young people, and the sample that we surveyed were university aged and a little older, so you're looking at 30 and younger, overwhelmingly 80% said yes to a question similar to that. There is an expectation, and perhaps based on their following of overseas sports, particularly in America, where athletes can be very outspoken on political and social issues, there is therefore an acceptance and even an expectation that sporting organisations and athletes will lead on social issues. It doesn't impact their view of the organisation negatively, even if they disagree with the organisation. There is almost an acceptance that that's the way the mop flops. We expect organisations, rich, powerful, resource wealthy organisations to lead in society. And it must be said, most of the, progressive values that sporting organisations exhibit are aligned with the demographic I'm talking about. So they are in agreement. If you talk to an older demographic who grew up where sport is very much separate to the ordinary and the real, if you like, it's separate to social and political issues, it is their escape, and they still treat it as escapism, and so does everyone to an extent. They take a much, harder view of this, that no, stick to sport. The reason I love you, Australian rules football, is because I can escape all of those other things and just appreciate the game. So please don't ruin my, fantasy land. Don't ruin my escape. Just stick to what I love, and that's the sport. I think we'll see that less and less. I think young people also think that there is an absence of leadership politically and are not in tune with the politics of today. And in the absence of politicians leading, that they do look to sporting organisations to lead. And in that, they don't necessarily see sporting organisations as just sporting organisations. They are organisations embedded in society who deal with social issues, just like every organisation with a number of employees. And because of their public profile and because of their power and influence, then there is an expectation that they will have a say on important issues that affect their people being their athletes and their people being the fans, which is a very broad representation of society.
And so one example of that was the video that the Socceroos did prior to departing for the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, where they basically brought awareness to their fans about the issues that were being faced by migrant workers and members of the LGBTQI plus community over in Qatar. Is it, however, and they were widely lauded by both federal government and online social media for doing that video. But is it, as you said, if we are expecting as sports fans more from our sporting organisations, is it hypocritical for an organisation to raise awareness and raise the issues but still participate in the event if they believe that Qatar wasn't, the most appropriate or an appropriate place to hold such an event?
Yeah, yes, it is hypocritical in many respects, but it's part of the compromise that we discussed earlier. I mean, what would be the cost of not going? And because of this, things tend not to change because everybody really is willing to compromise. Because what is the cost culturally of not going? What is the cost financially of not going? What is the cost for your fans in Australia of not competing? What is the cost of being true to your values? And this is a dilemma. This is an ethical dilemma. More often than not, that compromise is willing to be made, and really, when it comes to the fan base, it's willing to be accepted because the more compelling narrative does, I guess, relate to the concept of escapism. People are aware of the human rights issues, but they don't necessarily want to read about it or even acknowledge it as much as they would or should otherwise, because they are caught up in the romance of the event and what the sport means to them and all the good things it does for them, such as the hope and anticipation and pride and togetherness and the wonderful euphoria that we saw with each Socceroos victory. That is often the more compelling story for them because of the way it makes them feel. It is a first-hand experience that they are feeling as opposed to an awareness of how other people are being impacted in another country around the world. So, they look at these things and shake their heads and say, no, that's not right, but they don't feel it like they feel the contest. And as a result, at the end of it, people will say, oh, it shouldn't have been held in Qatar. But I bet that there is long-lasting stories of Australia's success and stories of people being at Federation Square and stories of people jumping for joy and all the great things that sport provides. So when the Socceroos make their statement but then still play, that is probably what their fans want them to do. And as a result of that, there is an acceptance that that's the way it is. And as a result of that, it is not out of the realms of possibility that a country with as questionable human rights issues as Qatar may end up hosting a mega event like that again in the near future.
There was an interesting case study on home soil around sponsorship and whether it's appropriate for one person to boycott a sponsor, which was Pat Cummins, who said to Cricket Australia that he wouldn't appear in any Alinta Energy commercials based on his other advocacy work with climate action. Now, the question that kind of raises is, do you need stakeholder consensus when you're signing a sponsor? Like, do you actually have to basically get a vote where everyone says, yeah, we're okay with this and tick off on it before you sign the sponsor? Because you can kind of avoid this sort of situation where you might have one player or a series of players saying, don't want to be part of that. I should caveat that by saying the Alinta Energy ads have always been some of the worst television. Purely from a non-serious point of view, I wouldn't want to be involved, but I don't want to deflect from the seriousness of what we're talking about.
Well, it's a really interesting dilemma as well. I mean, do you need to go around to every single employer, every single stakeholder you have to get consensus on this? Is it that majority rules? Is it that these things take place by an evolving negotiation where everyone agrees enough that they're on board, understanding, that values are at play and so too are commercial realities? I don't necessarily know that everyone needs to be aligned, but when you have the captain of your organisation, the lead athlete of your organisation in conflict with your commercial partnerships, that is problematic from a cohesion perspective. And even for the, sponsor, they don't want it necessarily out there where their dirty laundry is being aired because of the grievances of a particular player. So the ideal is that ideal situation is that everyone's on board. What was interesting to that is the way the mainstream media also treated that issue and the way they framed a significant level of hypocrisy around him, delving into his life and that he flies here and there and that his car is a petrol guzzler, as if you have to basically stop living if you have strong views on sustainability. You can still promote and endorse the idea that organisations, set targets and become more environmentally friendly without, needing to catch a ship to go and play in India. It doesn't really make sense to me, that argument. But it certainly did cause angst, and that's not what you want from a sponsorship. It is supposed to be mutually beneficial. It is supposed to be mutually exclusive, and always, not just now, always congruence and values alignment have been at the centre of it. I think what's interesting now is athletes are willing to speak about their values and are expecting their employer to also live the values that reflect the playing group. That doesn't necessarily answer the question to say that I always expect some level of dissent, because I go back to what we discussed at the beginning with compromise. It will be very difficult to find in our very competitive, cluttered, difficult market to find sponsorship, an ideal situation where you have all the money in the world and you haven't compromised at all, not even a little bit, on any of the values that any of your employees have. I think that's an ideal. I just don't think it's a reality.
One stakeholder we haven't talked too much about so far this podcast is actually the sponsors themselves. And so is there actually an increased risk now to sponsorship in the future because of the risk of dissent or the risk of the conversation no longer being controlled? Because, once upon a time, Venison Hedges used to sponsor the cricket team, and they used to puff away politely or joyfully because that's what was, part of society. Whereas now, if a alcohol or gambling company starts to sponsor a national organisation, there will be kickback and there will be suggestions that there is hypocrisy. And that's now going to energy companies. That's now going to, marketing firms and banking firms. Like, is there now any brand that's actually safe enough to really commit to being a sponsor of a massive sporting organisation?
Well, it is a risk because, you do run the risk of all the, perhaps unsavoury things, that exist because of the operations of your organisation being aired and, drawing attention to it, whether you otherwise wouldn't. I mean, there's always been some risks with sponsorship. I mean, if you align yourself to a sporting organisation, you are aligned to a very public product, and that can be great. Because, you can be popular by association. You can also be negative by association. If you wake up in the morning and find that the team that you sponsor has been scuffing a ball with sandpaper, then, you are aligned to that organisation, and what the organisation does next is based on their values, and you have a relationship with those values. There has always been that level of risk, but there is nothing wrong with living in a world where everyone is encouraged to do things better. And if that is the outcome of athletes and sporting organisations striving to represent admirable values, then, so be it. And if it makes it more difficult for corporate organisations who run the risk of what they do from day to day being exposed, well, again, so be it. That is the world that we live in. And it always has been. It's just that society evolves. Our values change. They will be different in 20 years from now. And so there will be a fresh set of issues that we're discussing. Issues around sustainability, environmentalism might be done. Everyone might then be on board, but it'll be something else. So, that's part of it. The other thing is the inconsistencies, though. I mean, you talk about gambling organisations. The AFL have significant deals, and so too do their broadcasters with corporate bookmakers. And yet all of their clubs are being encouraged to disassociate themselves from corporate bookmakers. What is the difference between glorifying or accepting sports gambling or gambling on horse racing, but not poker machines? Because at the moment, sports gambling is the fastest growing form of gambling and will overtake pokies in around a decade's time if the growth continues. But, you don't necessarily hear the AFL backing away from their corporate bookmaking sponsorships. We know some athletes have had issues with alcohol, but, they take a lot of money from alcohol sponsors. And at the end of that, they will say, yes, we do. We do take money from them, but it means that we can invest back in the community. We can fund community clubs. We can fund junior sport. We can create pathways for people to develop a career in sport. And so we are willing to compromise because on the balance of things, we think the money we get from them does a hell of a lot more good than bad. Those debates will rage forever, I imagine.
I suppose as a closing question then is, what do stakeholders need to keep in mind when trying to organise corporate sponsorships and arrangements in sport?
Well, probably all the things we've discussed today. Like, you have to balance the fors and against. There will be risk. And if it's high risk, then you might, balk at the high reward and just back out. So you are looking at that, the reputation of the organisations you're aligning with, and within that, as a result, is values. That is not new. Again, I just want to make that point. Organisations forever and a day have tried to align themselves with like-minded organisations that share a particular view of the world or values. Again, perhaps the debate around various social issues and the leading role athletes and sporting organisations are taking on social issues mean that the whole values part of an agreement is now amplified. Again, I don't think that's very much of a bad thing, particularly if it leads to further discussions, negotiations, and everyone trying to do better or understanding the other person. So I think you need to just consider all of those things. And you need to be aware that if you are aligning with an organisation, you are fundamentally aligning with their values. And by that, it also means the values of the athletes, who now more than ever will speak. There is athletes around the world that have been, speaking about social issues, forever and a day, from, equality of women in tennis with Billie Jean King back in the, 60s and 70s, right through to Black Lives Matter and LeBron James taking a very active role in the US election and ensuring people could vote. Wimbledon banning Russian players and Belarusian players, back to the 30s when, Hitler, we talk about sports washing. I mean, this is 1936, and he was acutely aware of the way in which Germany was being perceived, and he was also acutely aware of the image that he wanted to portray. And only a few years later, we had a world war. So, it's always happened. It will always continue, but values will, I think, become an even bigger part of the negotiation process, and all parties should go in with their eyes wide open.
And that we will. Thank you very much, Sam and Jack, for joining us today. And thank you all for listening. If you found today's episode entertaining or insightful, make sure you subscribe to Michelson Alexander Explains on your podcast platform of choice or via our YouTube channel. And if you have a topic or theme that you'd like us to cover in the future, please let us know by leaving a comment or review. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.